Hello, my name is Susan Playfair. I'm going to be talking for a few moments about Theology, Ecology and Values by Celia Dean Drummond in the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Science. I put the cover of the book here for ease, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Celia Dean Drummond herself, a bit about virtue ethics, specifically Aquinas, and then we'll go into her thesis, which is that virtue ethics is an appropriate approach to complex questions in ecology, and then go into a bit more detail about our discussion, and afterwards I'll have a slide on a couple of challenges or critiques to our thesis, and then we'll move on to questions. So moving swiftly on. A little bit about Celia Dean Drummond herself. She has a BA in Natural Sciences, an MA in Natural Sciences, and a PhD in Plant Physiology, and BA in Theology, and then a PhD in Systematic Theology as well. She's currently the Director of Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall, Oxford. So she's very well qualified to be discussing this topic. Her published books are about genetics and Christian ethics, eco-theology, religion and ecology, and theological ethics. So she's clearly very much au fait with what she's talking about. The thesis is that specialization reduces holistic perspectives, resulting in fragmentation. It's a pretty easy thesis to support. Virtue ethics is an appropriate holistic approach to complex questions in ecology, and she draws on the classical traditions of Thomas Aquinas, and specifically wisdom, prudence, justice and fortitude, and faith, hope and charity. So she argues that Christian theological ethics, specifically the Christian virtue ethics, which is why she's focusing on Aquinas rather than Aristotle or Plato, is a valid approach to engaging in current ecological challenges. And a little bit here about virtue ethics for those of us who haven't done undergraduate degrees in philosophy, so including me. So it's one of the three major approaches in normative ethics. So there's virtue ethics, deontology and consequentialism. And virtue ethics emphasizes virtues or moral character as its baseline, if you like, whereas deontology, which emphasizes duties or rules, consequentialism emphasizes consequence. They both refer to virtue, but it's not the basis. So the founders of virtue ethics, obviously across different civilizations, different people have come to the same subject. So in the Western rational tradition, we've got Plato and Aristotle. From the Eastern tradition, you've got Mencius and Confucius. Western theological, St. Thomas Aquinas, which is very much her focus here. But it's also worth reading about Anscombe, who was one of the modern philosophers in the mid-20th century. And she, together with Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley, and Iris Murdoch, the author, wrote wrote some very interesting papers and gave some very interesting arguments about ethics that really, some people would say they revolutionized it, but certainly brought it into a more modern perspective. Well worth looking at, and I've referred to some of her stuff at the back in the last slide. So virtue ethics is characterized by arete, excellence, phronesis, practical and moral wisdom, and eudaimonia, which is happiness or flourishing, which is the easiest translation of that. And then to go into a bit more about virtue ethics, so it assumes that the world is understood as created by God, is good, that the world is a gift, and that life is worth preserving. And the virtue ethical approach of this paper, Aquinas, virtue ethics, wisdom, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, and then faith, hope and charity. And the emphasis is in common good, encompassing all peoples throughout this paper. So it's very much from a very human perspective. So she talks about values in ecological science, and that's the opposition that ecological science has to anthropocentrism. And she references Lovelock, the Gaia hypothesis versus Darwinian dominance of Homo sapiens. And ecological science is more in favour of balance and flux, which she has a problem with. It opposes Aquinas' position on the utility of animals to humans as a measure of their worth. So basically, Aquinas said that if you couldn't eat it or use it for something, or if it served no useful function, or was of no benefit to humans, then it had no worth, which is a perspective. So Dean Drummond posits that the flux in ecological science makes it problematic as a natural basis for values, for other values surface that undermine the original notions. And to her concern here is that there is too much working on the datum, and the datum changes from time to time. She suggests that philosophy of naturalism is unhelpful and that it derives how we ought to behave from the way things are, and says it's inappropriate to deride or read off values from the natural world. And there's echoes here of the whole dominion thing in Genesis. You know, God gave man dominion over the animals and the birds and the fish. And she seems to contradict herself, though, in the article, in agreeing with Schloss that wisdom is living in a way that corresponds to how things are. But then she also goes on that says that wisdom should be about living in accordance with our knowledge of such sciences, but in a way that gives meaning to existence. Some people would say the science already does, but she thinks more. A deeper meaning to wisdom comes through theological reflection, but she doesn't give any justification for her reasoning here, and that's quite a big statement. So then she talks about rediscovering Christian values, and she's coming at this very much from the Aquinas theological virtue ethics perspective, which is fine. So responding to the charge that Christianity has exacerbated ecological crisis by notion of dominion over the earth, she gives three options for responses to this. One is the apologetic approach, so it's not dominion, but it's stewardship. Another one is to admit biblical anthropocentrism, but focus on other biblical strands more accommodating, such as the Book of Job, which emphasizes more about environmental care. Or the third option is to admit the flaws and seek other paradigms, e.g. feminism, pantheism, the Gaia hypothesis, but those don't really sit comfortably with the whole idea of Christian-focused virtue ethics. Certainly pantheism doesn't. So, Earth as home. She asks whether humans can feel at home given reality of suffering and loss currently experienced across species and cultures, but she doesn't explore this assertion. And that's a pretty big assertion, you know. She's giving that as part of the basis of what she's saying. She talks about immanence and transcendence of God in the world, the idea of God being with us, and if God is with us every day in the world, then it makes more sense and makes it easier to support the idea of an ethical approach to dealing with ecology and ecological issues. She talks about the eschatological traditions. There's an element, if the world's about to end soon, it doesn't really matter what we do with it, and if we treat that tradition or take a different approach to it, then that might encourage a more appropriate environmental response to what's going on at the moment. And she talks about Western versus Orthodox traditions, and she talks about a cosmic celebration in which each species is valued in itself, in which humanity's role is that of a priest. And that, again, is a very interesting perspective that I think it would have been very good if she could have continued more on about this. And she talks about stewardship versus citizenship versus servanthood, how to square this with the competing demands for value of different populations. Now, she goes into quite a lot of detail about that, but she doesn't really, she looks at things from an anthropocentric perspective, but it's very much a Western privileged perspective. You know, we need to do this and we need to do that, we need to take more responsibility, we need to do the next thing. But she's looking at it very much from a very comfortable, I would say a privileged middle class approach. You know, if you speak to somebody who's living in the slums of Cairo and ask them about virtue ethics and what matters to them, they're going to take a much narrower view about utility and about the ethics and about what they need to do to protect the environment. And that's going to be about food, shelter, and keeping their families safe. So I felt it was a very narrow approach that she took to the whole fascinating topic. So also it's very anthropocentric. So she talks about the virtue of humility as well as wisdom, but then emphasizes that common good is about encompassing all peoples. You could argue that if you're going to have virtue ethics, it should encompass all animals, and all of nature and all of the world. And I did feel there was a quasi-colonial approach to it. You know, there was a certain amount of, you know, we know what's good for everybody, so we're going to tell you what you all should do. You know, that's an approach, but it's not terribly valid if your biggest concern is trying to get clean drinking water. Lack of recognition that eco-theology is a wicked problem, and I've put a slide at the end with a couple of bits of additional reading. Wicked problems are those where there is no one answer, where one person's solution is another person's exacerbation of the problem. So I find them fascinating, and I think a recognition that things are wicked problems makes it much, much easier for an open and honest debate that's less partisan, if you like. And she said that non-expert public knowledge can make a contribution, and social scientists have found ways of demonstrating that new questions arise in such contexts. Now, I was quite cynical about this when I read it until I went and looked up more about her and realised that she's expert in all the fields that she's talking about. Temperance. She talks about pride and covetousness creeping in when estimates of benefits of new biotechnologies overreach their genuine possibility and value. And she doesn't really talk much about what constitutes value here in her discussion. And there's a definite lack of exploration of non-Western Christian mythologies. Now, I think Aquinas's virtue ethics must be applicable across Eastern and Orthodox interpretations of Christianity, as well as just the Western Catholic one, and it would have been very interesting to have more of an explanation or a discussion about that, I felt. So that's kind of my exegesis of the text. Here are some questions about it. So do you think Christian theological ethics is a helpful lens with which to view ecology in terms of understanding and offering ways forward? Secondly, discuss whether Aquinas' virtue ethics is a valid approach to complex questions in ecology, an anthropocentric versus an ecocentric approach. And what are your thoughts on a requirement to develop those dimensions of justice that are attuned to the non-human world, along and in companionship with the need of future generations of persons, which she says, but she doesn't expand on again. And then a slightly cheeky question. Who else agrees that the last slide in each lecture should be a reference section so that we can find out an extra additional reading that's been sourced in the lecture? Okay, that's my small contribution. I stand in awe of a lot of the other stuff that I've read, but I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for your time. And there, I nearly forgot it, there is the suggested reading. So it's Lipscomb, Aquinas, and Rittel and Weber on wicked problems. Thank you for your time.